Hi, I'm Keon, a research analyst with Lipper. I'm here to talk to you about fund flow activity for the week ended Wednesday, January 6th. Let's start by taking a quick look at last week's market activity. It was a rough start to the year for both the Dow and the S&P 500. The Dow was off 4% and the S&P 500 retreated 3.5%. The markets were hurt by renewed fears of a global economic slowdown triggered by rough events out of China last week. One day last week, China had to trigger its circuit breakers on its stock market to put a stop to the extreme losses as it was suffering. And economic news coming out of China last week predicted continued economic slowdown for the country. On top of that, the markets also had to deal with some geopolitical issues as North Korea announced it tested a hydrogen bomb, and Middle East tensions escalated even further as it appeared that Iran and Saudi Arabia might be on the brink of facing off. Let's turn our attention back to the fund flow activity now. For last week's activity, our macro groups, equity funds, equity mutual funds had net outflows of $3.1 billion. Taxable bond funds also saw money leave, about $2.3 billion. Muni bond funds took in $735 million, while money market funds had over $16.7 billion leave their coffers. For these macro groups for 2015, overall we saw net outflows. For the year, these four groups experienced net outflows of $121 billion. It was the first time they had net outflows since 2011. The main contributors to these net outflows were taxable bond funds, which saw about $86 billion leave for the year, and equity funds, which had about $60 billion leave. The taxable bond fund number is the first annual net outflow since 2000 for the group, and the largest overall since we've been tracking flows data back to 1992. Let's take a closer look at our equity fund group now. The $3.1 billion in net outflows marked the 8th week out of 9 that the group has had net outflows. And as business as usual, we see domestic equity funds contributing the lion's share to the net outflow number as they had $2.9 billion leave their coffers, while non-domestic equity funds chipped in a little bit at $180 million in negative flows. Let's take a look at our equity ETF, the equity ETF counterparts now. Outflows in this group as well, $8.9 billion left last week. This broke a streak of 12 consecutive weeks of net inflows. The majority of the outflows centered around the SPDR S&P 500, which saw $5.8 billion leave, while the iShares Russell 2000 chipped in $1.1 billion in net outflows. Moving on now to the taxable bond funds. Let's start with the mutual fund group. As mentioned earlier, they had $2.3 billion in net outflows for the week. It's their 9th consecutive week of net outflows. In last week's activity, we saw investors fleeing the lower quality issues as loan par funds and high yield funds had net outflows of $556 million and $412 million respectively. Moving on to taxable bond ETFs now, we see that they had net outflows of $321 million for the week. $800 million in outflows are attributable to two Guggenheim 2015 products which closed their doors at the end of 2015. Let's take a look at our next group now, muni bond funds. They had net inflows of $735 million for the week, their 14th consecutive week of net inflows. During this run, they've taken in $6.3 billion in net new money. For 2015, they posted positive numbers with net inflows of $8.4 billion for the year. In last week's activity, the main contributor to the net inflows were funds in the national muni fund categories, which took in almost $700 million of the total. And within the national munis, intermediate muni debt bond funds had $280 million in net inflows. Let's move on to our last group now, money market funds. As stated earlier, they had net outflows of $16.7 billion for the week. The main culprit here were institutional money market funds, which saw just about $22 billion even leave their coffers. And for 2015, they also were able to post positive flows for the year as they took in $16 billion in net new money. Well, that wraps up this week's report. If you'd like to take a closer look at the data, please go to our website at www.lipperusfundflows.com, and please join us here again next week where another analyst will be speaking to you about that week's fund flows activity.